A judge demands her to speak louder, but instead of raising her voice, the soft-spoken witness utters a mysterious code that makes the entire courtroom freeze. Within seconds, armed agents storm in, and what seemed like a routine trial erupts into chaos. The judge's hostility, the witness's trembling hands, the murmurs in the gallery, it was all a setup. But not the kind anyone expected. This isn't just a trial, it's a battlefield masked by legal formalities where every word, every glare, hides something far more dangerous. The woman on the stand isn't just a nervous witness. And the judge's cruelty? It may not be cruelty at all. Why did she say the code? Why did the judge push her to the edge? And what secret have they both been hiding from the world and from each other? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The marble halls of Boston's federal courthouse echoed with hushed whispers and shuffling feet as Rosie McCarthy made her way toward courtroom 3. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her navy blue blazer, a gesture that did little to calm her racing heart. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Inside the courtroom, every wooden bench was packed with spectators, reporters with their notepads at the ready, and stern-faced officials in dark suits. The air felt thick with tension. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but sketch artists perched near the front, their pencils poised to capture every moment of what the newspapers had dubbed the Boston Relief Fund scandal. Rosie's sensible low heels clicked softly as she walked to the witness stand. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she kept her eyes down, trying to avoid the dozens of stares following her every move. She had practiced this moment countless times, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of all those eyes. "Please raise your right hand," the court clerk instructed, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. Rosie complied, willing her hand not to shake. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," Rosie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She winced internally at how timid she sounded. The sharp rap of a gavel cut through the murmuring crowd. "Order in the court," came the commanding voice of Judge Patricia Santos. The judge sat high above them all, her judicial robes perfectly pressed, her graying brown hair pulled back in an immaculate chignon. Wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose as she surveyed the courtroom with sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Rosie couldn't help but feel small under that penetrating gaze. Judge Santos's reputation for being tough but fair preceded her, and her presence seemed to fill the entire courtroom. The judge's stern expression gave nothing away as she nodded to the prosecution to begin. District Attorney Sarah Chen rose from her seat, straightening her charcoal gray suit. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," she requested. Rosie leaned slightly toward the microphone. "Rosalind McCarthy? I was an emergency dispatcher for the city of Boston for 6 years until 3 months ago." "And why did you leave that position, Ms. McCarthy?" Rosie paused, taking a deep breath. "I couldn't continue working there after what I discovered." The prosecutor nodded encouragingly. "Can you tell the court what exactly you discovered?" Rosie's fingers twisted together in her lap. "It started with irregular patterns in the emergency response logs. During the coastal flooding last year, I noticed that some of the relief fund allocations didn't match up with the actual emergency calls we received." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Santos's gavel came down once, the sharp sound making Rosie jump slightly. "Please continue, Ms. McCarthy," the judge instructed, her voice carrying both authority and an odd note that Rosie couldn't quite identify. "The numbers didn't make sense," Rosie continued, her voice growing steadier as she focused on the facts. "There were reports of emergency supplies being delivered to addresses that had never called for help. Large sums of money were being directed to contractors that didn't exist. When I cross-referenced the dispatch logs with the relief fund disbursements, I found millions of dollars being funneled into private accounts." The courtroom had grown so quiet that Rosie could hear the ancient heating system clicking in the walls. She could feel the weight of Judge Santos's gaze, but she kept her eyes focused on the prosecutor. "And what did you do with this information?" Ms. Chen asked. "I compiled everything into a report, but when I tried to submit it to my supervisor, Rosie swallowed hard. "He told me to forget what I'd seen. Said it would be better for everyone if I just looked the other way." Judge Santos shifted slightly in her seat, and Rosie caught a fleeting expression cross the older woman's face, something that looked almost like pain, quickly masked by her usual stern demeanor. "But you didn't look the other way, did you, Ms. McCarthy?" the prosecutor pressed. "No," Rosie answered, her voice stronger now. "I couldn't. People had lost their homes in that flood. They needed that money. Real people. Families. I couldn't just pretend I hadn't seen what was happening to their relief funds." The gravity of the moment settled over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Here she was, a former emergency dispatcher whose dedication to truth had brought her face to face with a corruption network that reached into the highest levels of city government. Rosie felt the full weight of her role as she sat in that witness stand, knowing her testimony could bring the whole system crashing down. Judge Santos cleared her throat. "Proceed with your questioning, Ms. Chen," she directed, but there was something in her tone, a slight wavering that someone who didn't know better might have missed. But Rosie heard it, and for just a moment their eyes met across the courtroom. Blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, looking into her own with an intensity that made her breath catch. As Rosie began detailing the paper trail she had uncovered, Judge Santos's demeanor shifted dramatically. The judge's fingers drummed against her desk, her earlier intensity transforming into something harder and colder. "Ms. McCarthy," Judge Santos cut in sharply, interrupting Rosie mid-sentence, "are you suggesting that you personally witnessed these alleged transactions?" Well, no, Your Honor," Rosie stammered, caught off guard by the judge's hostile tone. "But I have the documentation." "So this is hearsay?" Judge Santos interrupted again, her voice cutting through the air like ice. "You're presenting second-hand information based on paperwork you happened to come across while working as a dispatcher." A murmur of confusion rippled through the courtroom. Several spectators exchanged worried glances. Even the court reporter paused, her fingers hovering over her stenotype machine. District Attorney Chen rose quickly to her feet. "Your Honor, if I may—" "You may not," Judge Santos snapped. "I'm addressing the witness." She turned her stern gaze back to Rosie. "Tell me, Ms. McCarthy, what exactly qualifies you to interpret complex financial records? Do you have any accounting experience?" Rosie's cheeks flushed pink. "No, Your Honor. But the numbers clearly showed whatever you, with your limited expertise, believed they showed." Judge Santos's wire-rimmed glasses caught the light as she leaned forward. "I'm beginning to question whether someone so obviously unprepared should be testifying in my courtroom at all." The defense attorneys couldn't hide their pleased expressions. The lead counsel, Maxwell Bennett, barely suppressed a smile as he made a show of shuffling his papers. His client, former City Commissioner William Drake, Drake, sat back in his chair with a satisfied smirk. "Your Honor," Chen tried again, her voice tight with controlled frustration, "Ms. McCarthy has provided detailed evidence that appears to be nothing more than speculation and hearsay," Judge Santos cut in. She fixed Rosie with a withering stare. "I warn you, Ms. McCarthy, this court's time is valuable. If you continue with these unfounded accusations, I will have no choice but to hold you in contempt." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. A young reporter in the front row scribbled furiously in her notepad, her eyes wide with disbelief. Two senior prosecutors at the government's table exchanged alarmed looks. Rosie gripped the edge of the witness stand, her knuckles white, but her voice steadier than she felt. "Your Honor, I have brought copies of all the original documents. Documents you obtained while working as a dispatcher. Judge Santos interrupted yet again, her voice dripping with disdain. Documents you admit you're not qualified to interpret. Documents that, for all we know, you could have misunderstood entirely. The courtroom had grown so quiet that the tension felt like a physical presence. Rosie could feel drops of sweat forming at the back of her neck, but she forced herself to sit straight, even as her hands trembled in her lap. "This is highly irregular," one of the senior prosecutors whispered to Chen, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The defense team's satisfied expressions grew more pronounced with each of the judge's hostile interruptions. Judge Santos removed her glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose, as if dealing with a particularly trying child. "Ms. McCarthy, let me be clear. This court will not waste valuable time on unfounded accusations based on hearsay and speculation. If you cannot provide direct, first-hand evidence of these alleged crimes, then perhaps we should end this testimony now." Rosie's throat felt tight, but she managed to keep her voice from shaking. "Your Honor, I respectfully disagree. The evidence I've gathered..." "That's enough!" Judge Santos's voice cracked like a whip across the courtroom. "One more word of this nonsense, and I will hold you in contempt. Do you understand?" The silence that followed was deafening. Spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few older attorneys in the gallery shook their heads in disapproval at the judge's behavior. Even the court officers standing by the doors looked uncomfortable. District Attorney Chen stood once more, her jaw set. "Your Honor, I must object to this treatment of our witness." Judge Santos's eyes flashed. "Noted and overruled, Ms. Chen. Now either move on to something substantive or dismiss your witness." Rosie sat perfectly still in the witness stand, her face pale but composed. Though her hands shook slightly in her lap, she kept her gaze steady, even as Judge Santos glared down at her with undisguised hostility. The young woman who had entered the courtroom looking nervous but determined now sat at the center of a storm, weathering the unexpected and inexplicable fury of one of Boston's most respected judges. Despite Judge Santos's intimidating presence, Rosie took a deep breath and focused on why she was here. The faces of desperate families she'd helped during her time as an emergency dispatcher flashed through her mind, strengthening her resolve. "Your Honor," District Attorney Chen tried again, "perhaps if we approach this from a different angle? Ms. McCarthy, could you tell us about your experience handling emergency calls during Hurricane Nathan?" Rosie's voice grew steadier as she recalled the specific details. "On September 23, 2022, we received 412 calls for emergency assistance in a single 8-hour shift. I remember one call in particular from Mrs. Elena Rodriguez at 42 Maple Street. Her basement was flooding, and her disabled son was trapped downstairs." Judge Santos shifted impatiently. "Is there a point to this emotional manipulation, Ms. Chen?" But Rosie continued, her soft voice carrying surprising authority. "Mrs. Rodriguez had applied for emergency funding to modify her home for her son's wheelchair access. The application was approved, but the money never arrived. I discovered her application in a folder marked Processed on Commissioner Drake's computer, along with a transfer of $87,000 to an account at Cayman National Bank." The defense lawyers erupted in objections, but Rosie pressed on, her detailed recall evident in every word. The account number was CR7930458. The transfer was dated October 1, 2022, at 3:47 p.m. Eastern Time, authorized by William Drake's personal login credentials, WDRAKE-ADEMIN-246. The courtroom fell silent. Even Judge Santos seemed momentarily taken aback by Rosie's precise recollection. "I have similar documentation for 67 other cases," Rosie continued, her voice growing stronger. "Each emergency assistance application was marked as processed, but the funds were diverted to offshore accounts. I can provide exact dates, times, and account numbers for every transaction." Judge Santos's face darkened. Ms. McCarthy, I've warned you about making unfounded accusations. With respect, Your Honor, Rosie interrupted, surprising everyone, including herself, these aren't unfounded. As an emergency dispatcher, I had access to both the assistance applications and the city's financial records. It was my job to verify fund disbursement when following up on emergency cases. The prosecution team exchanged hopeful glances as Rosie retrieved a thick folder from beside her. I have copies of every transaction, cross-referenced with the original assistance applications. Each diverted payment corresponds to a family in crisis who never received their approved aid. Mr. Bennett, Judge Santos called to the defense attorney, do you have any objection to this line of questioning? The defense lawyer stood quickly. Absolutely, Your Honor. This is nothing but circumstantial evidence from an unqualified. The witness has direct access to these records as part of her official duties, Chen interjected, and her recall of specific details can be verified through official documentation. Rosie pulled out another paper. On November 12, 2022, Commissioner Drake accessed the emergency fund database at 9:12 a.m. Within 17 minutes, he had redirected 12 separate aid payments totaling $1,400,000 to an account at Swiss United Bank, number SU 8875621. The color drained from Commissioner Drake's face. His attorney grabbed his arm, whispering urgently. Judge Santos's attacks grew more aggressive. Ms. McCarthy, you're dancing dangerously close to accusations of criminal conspiracy without proper foundation. The foundation is in the documentation, Your Honor, Rosie responded, her voice trembling slightly but determined. Every transaction, every diverted payment, every family left without assistance, it's all here. I remember each case because I spoke to these people. I heard their stories. I promised them help was coming. The prosecution team sat straighter, clearly proud of their witness's composure under pressure. Chen stepped forward with another question, but Judge Santos cut her off. This court will take a 15-minute recess, the judge announced abruptly, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Ms. McCarthy, you will remain under oath. As the courtroom began to clear, Rosie remained in the witness stand, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The nervous dispatcher was still there in her demeanor, but something else had emerged. A quiet strength, a determination to see justice done despite the intimidation she faced. District Attorney Chen approached the witness stand. You're doing great, Rosie. Your detailed documentation and memory for specifics are exactly what we need. Don't let the judge's behavior rattle you. Rosie nodded, watching as Commissioner Drake huddled with his legal team in the corner, their urgent whispers and worried expressions suggesting her testimony had hit its mark. Despite Judge Santos's hostile interruptions, the truth was finally coming to light. The families who had suffered without their promised aid might finally see justice. The bailiff called for order as people began returning to their seats. Judge Santos would return any moment, likely with more attempts to discredit Rosie's testimony. But now, behind her quiet exterior, Rosie felt more certain than ever about her purpose here. Her extraordinary memory and unwavering moral compass had guided her to this moment, and she wouldn't back down. Not when she was so close to exposing the truth. As the courtroom settled back in after recess, District Attorney Lawrence Brennan made his entrance, his tall frame commanding attention as he strode to a seat in the front row. His silver hair caught the fluorescent lighting, and his expensive suit marked him as someone of influence. He watched the proceedings with an air of quiet satisfaction, his dark eyes fixed on Judge Santos with an unsettling intensity. The judge resumed her assault on Rosie's testimony. Ms. McCarthy, your supposed evidence amounts to nothing more than coincidental timing of routine financial transactions. Rosie's emergency dispatcher training had taught her to notice details others might miss. Even as she responded to the judge's accusations, her attention caught on two men in dark suits who had separated upon entering the gallery. One moved to sit near the emergency exit while the other positioned himself closer to the main doors. Their movements were too precise, too calculated. Your Honor, Rosie continued, keeping her voice steady while maintaining awareness of the men's positions, The pattern of transactions directly correlates with each denied assistance claim. The man near the emergency exit adjusted his jacket for the third time in 5 minutes. Rosie recognized the telltale bulge beneath his left arm, the same profile she'd learned to identify during her emergency response training when dealing with armed individuals. Judge Santos's voice grew sharper. "Ms. McCarthy, your continued insistence on seeing patterns where none exist is trying my patience." From his front row seat, District Attorney Brennan's lips curved into a slight smile. His calculating gaze shifted between the judge and Rosie, like a chess master watching pieces move exactly where he wanted them. The second man in the gallery kept touching his ear, suggesting an earpiece. Rosie had seen similar behavior patterns during coordinated emergency response operations. These men weren't random spectators. They were positioned with purpose. "I have to object, Your Honor," Chen interrupted. "The witness is presenting documented evidence, not patterns." "Overruled," Judge Santos snapped, her behavior becoming increasingly erratic. "Ms. McCarthy, I'm warning you one final time about making unfounded accusations." Rosie noticed how Brennan's expression remained unchanged despite the judge's obvious bias. His calmness seemed out of place, almost as if he expected the hostility. The two men in the gallery had now established clear sightlines to both the witness stand and the judge's bench. More subtle details caught Rosie's attention: the way the men kept checking their watches at regular intervals, the slight nod they exchanged when a court officer walked past, the careful way they maintained specific distances from key exits. Her years of emergency response work had trained her to recognize coordinated behavior patterns. "Your Honor," Rosie said, fighting to keep her voice steady while monitoring the growing tension in the room, "I can provide exact timestamps for each diverted payment." Judge Santos's face flushed with anger. "Ms. McCarthy, you are deliberately misrepresenting standard financial procedures." "The documents show otherwise, Your Honor," Rosie persisted, even as she tracked another subtle exchange between the two men in the gallery. Brennan leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes gleaming with interest as the judge's composure continued to crack. The man near the emergency exit shifted his weight, his hand brushing against his concealed weapon. The gallery had grown unnaturally quiet, the spectators sensing the mounting tension. Reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks, documenting the judge's increasingly inappropriate behavior. The prosecution team exchanged worried glances, clearly concerned about the direction of the proceedings. Rosie's pulse quickened as she noticed more warning signs. The two men had begun checking their watches more frequently. Their positions had shifted slightly, creating clearer paths to their targets. Everything about their body language suggested they were preparing for action. "This court will not tolerate these baseless accusations," Judge Santos declared, her voice rising. "One more word about supposed corruption, Ms. McCarthy, and I will have you removed." District Attorney Brennan's satisfied smile widened, almost imperceptibly. He appeared to be the only person in the courtroom completely at ease with the judge's outbursts. His comfort with the chaos felt deliberate, calculated. The tension in the room had become almost unbearable. The two men maintained their strategic positions, their presence creating an invisible web of threat that only Rosie seemed to notice. Her emergency response instincts were screaming warnings about their coordinated movements and careful positioning. The prosecution team huddled together, whispering urgently as Judge Santos's behavior became increasingly erratic. The defense attorneys looked both pleased and confused by the judge's obvious bias. Commissioner Drake kept glancing nervously between Rosie and Brennan, his face pale with stress. Through it all, Rosie maintained her composure, drawing on years of handling crisis situations. She kept her responses measured and precise, while staying alert to the dangerous choreography playing out in the gallery. The two men had created perfect angles of attack, their positions carefully chosen for whatever they were planning. District Attorney Brennan observed it all with the air of someone watching a well-rehearsed play, his dark eyes reflecting satisfaction as Judge Santos continued her relentless attacks on Rosie's credibility. The layers of deception in the courtroom were building towards something explosive, with hidden agendas shifting beneath the surface of the official proceedings. Judge Santos's face had turned an alarming shade of red as she leaned forward over her bench, her patience clearly exhausted. The veins in her neck stood out as she jabbed her finger toward Rosie. "Ms. McCarthy, I have had enough of your mumbling. This is your final warning. Speak up, or I will hold you in contempt of court." The judge's voice echoed off the courtroom walls, making several spectators flinch. Rosie sat perfectly still in the witness box, her hands folded in her lap. Her apparent nervousness had vanished, replaced by an unmistakable clarity of purpose. Instead of shrinking away from the judge's outburst, she straightened her spine and took a deep breath. The two men in the gallery tensed, their hands moving subtly toward their concealed weapons. District Attorney Brennan leaned forward, anticipating what he thought would be Rosie's surrender to the judge's intimidation. But Rosie didn't continue her testimony. Instead, she lifted her chin and called out in a clear, commanding voice that filled every corner of the courtroom, "Code Black Alpha 9." The effect was immediate and electric. The entire courtroom froze, as if someone had pressed pause on a video. Judge Santos's mouth hung open mid-tirade. The spectators sat motionless, confusion written across their faces. Even the court reporter's fingers hovered uncertainly over her stenotype machine. In the gallery, the two men's expressions shifted from confusion to alarm as they realized their cover was blown. One of them started to reach inside his jacket, but before he could complete the motion, the courtroom doors burst open. Armed federal agents in tactical gear poured into the room from multiple entrances. "Federal agents, everyone stay where you are, hands where we can see them." The commanding voice cut through the stunned silence. The two would-be assassins found themselves surrounded before they could react, their weapons discovered and confiscated. One agent announced loudly, "2 firearms recovered, suspects secured." Chaos erupted as people finally processed what was happening. Spectators ducked under benches while reporters scrambled to capture every detail. The defense attorneys stood frozen behind their table, hands raised. Commissioner Drake had gone pale, his eyes darting between the arrested men and District Attorney Brennan. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Santos demanded, but her voice had lost its authority. Federal agents had already moved to secure her bench. Rosie stood up in the witness box, pulling a badge from beneath her jacket. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," she announced, her voice strong and clear. Nothing like the timid witness she'd pretended to be. "This entire proceeding has been part of an ongoing federal investigation into corruption and conspiracy to commit murder." The courtroom erupted in gasps and exclamations. Camera flashes burst from the media section as reporters realized they were witnessing something far bigger than a simple corruption trial. "The two men you've just arrested," Rosie continued, addressing the lead tactical agent, "were positioned to carry out an assassination attempt. They were waiting for a specific signal from their co-conspirators. The federal agents efficiently secured the scene, checking every corner of the courtroom while keeping the two arrested men firmly restrained. The would-be assassins' faces showed a mix of shock and anger as they realized their carefully planned operation had been thwarted. District Attorney Brennan's satisfied smile had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped scowl as agents approached him. His calculated composure crumbled as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered in his own scheme. The prosecution team looked as stunned as everyone else, finally understanding why their star witness had endured such hostile treatment from the judge. They watched in amazement as Rosie McCarthy, the supposedly nervous former emergency dispatcher, took control of the situation with the confidence of a seasoned federal agent. Judge Santos's face had drained of all color as she gripped the edges of her bench. The federal agents surrounding her made it clear that her authority in this courtroom had ended. Her earlier bullying behavior now stood revealed as part of a deeper, darker conspiracy that had just been exposed. The tactical team worked with practiced efficiency, securing the suspects and establishing a perimeter around the courtroom. They began evacuating spectators in an orderly fashion while evidence technicians moved in to document the scene. Through it all, Rosie maintained her professional composure, coordinating with the tactical team and directing the securing of evidence. The nervous witness had disappeared completely, replaced by a confident federal agent who had just orchestrated the takedown of a complex criminal conspiracy. The courtroom that had moments ago been the scene of a corrupt judge's apparent bullying of a witness had transformed into an active federal crime scene. The true nature of the proceedings, and Rosie's role in them, had been revealed in one dramatic moment, triggered by those 4 simple words, Code Black Alpha 9. As federal agents continued securing the courtroom, Judge Patricia Santos descended from her bench. Her stern demeanor had melted away, replaced by a look of profound relief. She approached Rosie with quick, purposeful steps, ignoring the startled reactions from the court staff. "Well done, Agent McCarthy," Judge Santos said warmly, extending her hand. The complete transformation in her tone drew gasps from the spectators who remained in the gallery. "I apologize for my harsh words earlier, but we had to maintain your cover at all costs." Rosie grasped the judge's hand firmly, a small smile playing at her lips. "No apologies needed, Your Honor. Your performance was exactly what we needed to sell my role as the frightened witness." The lead tactical agent, Special Agent Torres, joined them. Judge Santos's cooperation was crucial to this operation, he explained to the stunned courtroom. Her theatrical display of hostility convinced the assassins that Agent McCarthy was nothing more than an intimidated civilian witness. The prosecution team exchanged bewildered looks as understanding dawned on their faces. The assistant district attorney stood up, his voice shaky. "You mean all of this was planned? The interruptions, the threats of contempt?" "Every single moment," Rosie confirmed. She turned to address the remaining spectators and press. "For the past 8 months, I've been working undercover with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My role as an emergency dispatcher wasn't entirely fictional. That was my previous career. But I've been a federal agent for the past 3 years." Judge Santos nodded approvingly. Agent McCarthy's supposed nervousness and my apparent cruelty were carefully choreographed to prevent anyone from suspecting she was anything more than what she appeared to be, a reluctant witness who stumbled upon evidence of corruption. The reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks as Rosie continued. "We knew the corruption network had hired assassins to eliminate any threats to their operation. Judge Santos's hostile treatment made me appear vulnerable and ineffective, exactly the kind of witness they wouldn't consider a serious threat." "The more I berated Agent McCarthy," Judge Santos added, "the more convinced they became that her testimony would fall apart under pressure. They never suspected she was gathering evidence of their assassination plot while pretending to be intimidated by my questioning." Special Agent Torres stepped forward. "Judge Santos has been working with the FBI for months, helping us identify the key players in this conspiracy. Her cooperation was essential in maintaining Agent McCarthy's cover and preventing the assassins from acting before we could secure all the evidence we needed." The courtroom absorbed this revelation in stunned silence. The carefully crafted illusion of an intimidated witness and a hostile judge had completely fooled everyone, including the corruption network's assassins, who were now being led away in handcuffs. One of the court clerks raised her hand tentatively. "But, Your Honor, those things you said about Agent McCarthy being unprepared, wasting the court's time?" Judge Santos smiled apologetically. "Every harsh word was planned in advance with the FBI. We needed to present a convincing show of judicial intimidation. The more I appeared to undermine Agent McCarthy's confidence, the less likely anyone was to suspect her true identity." "The operation required absolute precision," Rosie explained. "One slip in either of our performances could have tipped off the assassins. Judge Santos's theatrical displays of anger provided the perfect cover for me to observe their reactions and confirm their intentions." The prosecutors, who had spent the entire morning wincing at Judge Santos's treatment of their supposed star witness, now stared at both women with newfound respect. The elaborate deception had fooled not just the criminals, but every single person in the courtroom. "I must admit," the lead prosecutor said, shaking his head in amazement, "I was beginning to question Your Honor's judicial temperament. I even considered filing a complaint with the Judicial Review Board." Judge Santos laughed, a warm, genuine sound that seemed impossible coming from the same person who had been berating Rosie just minutes earlier. "Then we did our jobs well. The more uncomfortable you became with my behavior, the more convincing our performance was to the real targets of this operation." Rosie moved closer to the judge, their earlier adversarial dynamic completely erased. Judge Santos took a significant risk to her reputation to help us maintain this cover. Her willingness to appear unfair and hostile was crucial to the success of our operation. The judge placed a gentle hand on Rosie's shoulder, a gesture that would have seemed unthinkable mere minutes ago. Agent McCarthy showed extraordinary courage throughout this operation, maintaining her cover as a nervous witness while actually conducting complex surveillance required remarkable skill and composure. The remaining spectators watched in fascination as the two women continued speaking quietly together, their earlier hostility revealed as an elaborate act that had fooled everyone in the room. The apparent conflict between a bullying judge and a frightened witness had been transformed into a demonstration of professional cooperation between two dedicated law enforcement professionals. District Attorney Lawrence Brennan stood up from his seat in the gallery, his carefully maintained facade of professional dignity crumbling as federal agents approached him. His expensive suit and silver hair, usually projecting an image of authority, now seemed like cheap theater costumes. "This is outrageous," he sputtered, his dark eyes darting between Judge Santos and the advancing agents. "I demand to know the meaning of this interruption to court proceedings." Special Agent Torres stepped forward, holding up a warrant. "District Attorney Brennan, you're under arrest for conspiracy, embezzlement, and multiple counts of attempted murder." Judge Santos's voice rang out clear and strong. "For 20 years, Mr. Brennan has been running a corruption network that goes far beyond simple theft of disaster relief funds." She turned to face the stunned courtroom. "He specifically requested me to preside over this case, believing he could control me through blackmail." Brennan's face twisted with rage. "You're making a terrible mistake, Patricia. Remember what's at stake for you." "You mean the fabricated evidence you've been using to blackmail me?" Judge Santos's voice was steady now, free from fear. "The FBI has already exposed those documents as forgeries. Your hold over me is finished." Rosie stepped forward, her earlier nervous demeanor completely gone. "We've uncovered the full scope of your operation, Mr. Brennan. It wasn't just about stealing money meant for emergency services. You deliberately delayed emergency responses to cover up the missing funds." The courtroom fell silent as the true horror of Brennan's crimes began to emerge. Special Agent Torres produced a thick folder of documents. "During the Cedar Valley floods last year, emergency response times were artificially delayed by 45 minutes. 3 people died waiting for help that was intentionally held back. The money that should have funded additional emergency response teams was in offshore accounts," Rosie continued, her voice tight with controlled anger. "When natural disasters struck, Brennan's network would create artificial delays claiming resource shortages that they themselves had caused." Judge Santos addressed the shocked spectators. "Mr. Brennan approached me 5 years ago with what appeared to be evidence of judicial misconduct from early in my career. He threatened to destroy my reputation unless I cooperated with his scheme." "The blackmail materials were sophisticated forgeries," Special Agent Torres explained. "Brennan used them to force Judge Santos to appear biased against key witnesses in cases that threatened his operation." He believed he could control her the same way during this trial? Brennan's calculated composure finally shattered. "You've been working with them all along," he snarled at Judge Santos. "I chose you for this case because I owned you." "You chose me because you thought you owned me," Judge Santos corrected him. "That was your mistake. When the FBI approached me 3 months ago with proof that your blackmail materials were fake, I agreed to help expose your entire network. The lead prosecutor stood up, understanding dawning on his face. That's why you requested this specific judge for the trial, he said to Brennan. You thought she would discredit our witness under threat of blackmail. Instead, Rosie added, her apparent hostility toward me helped maintain my cover while we gathered evidence about the assassination plot and traced it back to you, Mr. Brennan. Special Agent Torres nodded to his team, who moved to take Brennan into custody. We've documented every death caused by your intentional delays, every family that lost someone while emergency services were deliberately held back. The evidence trail leads directly to your office. As the agents led Brennan away, Judge Santos addressed the courtroom one final time. For years, I lived in fear of his blackmail, believing I had no choice but to comply with his demands. The FBI showed me that his evidence was falsified, but agreed to let him believe he still controlled me so we could expose the full scope of his corruption. Rosie watched as Brennan was escorted out, his previous arrogance replaced by desperate fury. The network goes beyond Boston, she explained to the remaining spectators. Similar schemes were operating in 3 other cities, all connected to Brennan's organization. The investigation is still ongoing. The magnitude of the conspiracy left the courtroom in stunned silence. What had begun as a case about embezzled funds had exposed a criminal enterprise that had deliberately sacrificed lives to cover up their theft. District Attorney Lawrence Brennan, who had spent decades building his reputation as a crusader against corruption, had been revealed as the architect of a scheme that turned public tragedy into private profit. Judge Santos stepped down from her bench, finally free from the weight of Brennan's blackmail. The person who had appeared to be a hostile judge bullying a nervous witness had been revealed as a crucial ally in exposing a deadly conspiracy. The carefully maintained illusion had fooled everyone, especially Lawrence Brennan, who had believed until the very end that he controlled both women through fear and manipulation. As the commotion surrounding Brennan's arrest began to settle, Judge Patricia Santos remained rooted behind her bench, her fingers gripping the wooden edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her eyes were fixed on Rosie, who was conferring with Special Agent Torres about securing the scene. Agent McCarthy, Judge Santos called out, her voice wavering slightly. A moment in my chambers, please. Rosie looked up, professional mask still firmly in place, and nodded. Of course, Your Honor. The judge's chambers felt oddly quiet after the chaos of the courtroom. Judge Santos closed the heavy oak door and turned to face the young agent who had so brilliantly maintained her cover throughout the operation. For a moment, neither woman spoke. I knew it was you the moment you walked into my courtroom, Judge Santos finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. My little Rosie. Rosie's professional composure cracked. Her face went pale, and she took an involuntary step backward. What did you just say? 20 years ago, I had to leave you and your father, Judge Santos continued, tears welling in her eyes. Not because I wanted to, because I had to protect you both. No. Rosie shook her head, her auburn ponytail swaying with the movement. My mother abandoned us. She walked out when I was 8 years old. My father died believing his wife had just left. Judge Santos reached for a framed photograph on her desk, hands trembling as she held it out. The picture showed a much younger version of herself holding a small girl with familiar auburn hair. They were both laughing, their faces bright with joy. I was a junior prosecutor then, she explained, her voice thick with emotion. I uncovered evidence of corruption in the district attorney's office. Not Brennan, his predecessor. But the network was already in place. They threatened to kill you and your father if I didn't disappear. Rosie stared at the photograph, her trained investigator's eye, noting details she had forgotten from her childhood. The way her mother's smile crinkled the corners of her eyes. The matching butterfly clips they both wore in their hair. "You could have told us," Rosie said, her voice cracking. "Dad died thinking you didn't love us enough to stay." They were watching us constantly. Judge Santos took a shaky breath. "If I had given any hint, shown any sign of contact, I couldn't risk your lives. So I disappeared, changed my name, worked my way up through the system, always hoping I could one day make things right. When I walked into your courtroom," Rosie started. "I nearly broke down right there," Judge Santos admitted. "My little girl, all grown up, walking into danger. When the FBI approached me about helping with the operation, they had no idea about our connection. I couldn't tell them. Couldn't risk compromising your cover. So every harsh word, every time you attacked my testimony..." Rosie's eyes widened with understanding. "Was killing me inside," her mother finished. "But I had to make it convincing. Had to protect you one more time, even if you hated me for it." Tears spilled down Rosie's cheeks. "I spent 20 years thinking you abandoned us because we weren't enough for you." "You were everything to me," Judge Santos said, taking a tentative step forward. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone I missed. I thought about you every single day. Watched from a distance as you grew up, became an emergency dispatcher, then joined the FBI." "The hostility in court," Rosie said, professional analysis mixing with personal revelation. "You weren't just maintaining my cover as an agent. You were trying to make me look weak, unthreatening. To keep the assassins from seeing you as a serious threat," her mother confirmed. "When I saw them positioning themselves in the gallery, I pushed harder, made myself more intimidating. I needed everyone to believe you were nothing more than a frightened witness." The weight of 2 decades of misunderstanding hung heavy in the air between them. Judge Santos, Patricia, stood with her hands clasped tightly together, as if physically restraining herself from reaching out to her daughter. "I understand if you can't forgive me," she said softly, "but please believe that everything I did, including today, was to protect you." Rosie looked at her mother, really looked at her, seeing past the stern judicial demeanor to the woman who had sacrificed everything to keep her family safe. The woman who had maintained her cruel facade in court even while her heart was breaking, who had turned her own pain into a shield to protect her daughter one last time. "When Dad died," Rosie said, her voice catching, "his last words were about you. He said he wished he knew why you left, that there had to be a reason he never understood." "Oh, Michael," Patricia whispered, grief evident in her voice. "I wanted to come back so many times. For both of you." The two women stood in silence, 20 years of loss and love and sacrifice filling the space between them. The revelation had rewritten everything Rosie thought she knew about her past, about her mother, about the very operation they had just completed together. The professional agent in Rosie knew they would need to return to the courtroom soon to complete the operation and secure the scene. But for this moment, she allowed herself to be that 8-year-old girl again, looking at the mother she had thought lost forever. Patricia wiped her eyes and walked to the window of her chambers, looking out over the Boston skyline. "It started 20 years ago, when I was just a junior prosecutor," she began, her voice steadying as she shared the truth she'd carried alone for so long. "I found discrepancies in the disaster relief fund accounts, small amounts at first, but they added up to millions." Rosie sat down in one of the leather chairs, her training kicking in as she listened with both a daughter's heart and an agent's mind. "I was so young, so naive," Patricia continued. "I thought I could just take the evidence to my superiors. I didn't realize then that Lawrence Brennan had already built his network throughout the system. He wasn't district attorney yet, but he was already pulling the strings." She turned back to face Rosie. "One evening, I received photos in my office mail. Pictures of you walking to school, playing in our backyard. Pictures of your father leaving work. There was a note that said, If I pursued the investigation, my family would suffer the consequences. Rosie's breath caught. But you could have gone to the FBI then, gotten us protection. Patricia shook her head, pain etching deeper lines around her eyes. Brennan had people everywhere. He showed me proof. Federal agents on his payroll, judges who looked the other way. He made it clear that witness protection wouldn't save you. The only way to keep you and your father alive was for me to disappear completely. So you just left? Rosie's voice cracked on the words. I left everything behind. My career, my family, my whole life. Patricia's hands trembled as she spoke. I changed my name, moved across the country, started over as Patricia Santos. Before that, I was Elizabeth McCarthy. I spent years building a new identity, working my way through the legal system again. You became a federal judge, Rosie said, understanding dawning in her eyes. Yes. I knew I needed to be in a position of power to eventually bring Brennan down. But I had to be patient, had to build an impeccable reputation so he wouldn't suspect me when I finally made my move. Patricia's voice grew stronger. I watched from afar as his network grew. He became district attorney, expanded his corruption scheme. The embezzled funds grew larger, and so did the body count when emergency services were delayed to cover up the thefts. Rosie leaned forward. All those years you were working to stop him? Every case I took, every connection I made, it was all building toward this moment. When I learned you had joined the FBI, I was terrified he would discover our connection. Patricia's voice softened. But I was also so proud. You grew up to fight the very corruption I had sacrificed everything to oppose. Did you know I would be involved in this case? Rosie asked. When the FBI approached me about cooperating in their operation, they had no idea about our relationship. Seeing you walk into my courtroom that first day, Patricia paused, emotion overwhelming her for a moment. I almost couldn't maintain my composure, but I knew I had to protect you one last time. By being cruel to me in court, Rosie said, making everyone believe you were compromised, working for Brennan. He thought he had me under his control through blackmail. He had no idea I had been working against him for 2 decades. Patricia moved closer to her daughter. Every harsh word I spoke to you in that courtroom felt like a knife in my heart. But I had to maintain the deception, had to make sure those assassins wouldn't see you as a threat. Rosie stood up, processing everything she had learned. Dad used to say there had to be a reason. He never believed you would just abandon us without cause. Your father was a good man, Patricia said softly. The hardest part was knowing he would die thinking I hadn't loved him enough to stay. But if my choice was between having you both alive and hating me, or dead, but loving me, she straightened her shoulders. I would make the same choice again. 20 years, Rosie whispered. You spent 20 years alone building this case against Brennan, sacrificing everything to protect us and bring him to justice. And now it's finally over, Patricia said, relief evident in her voice. Brennan's network is exposed. The assassins are in custody. You're safe at last. She hesitated, then added quietly, though I understand if it's too late for us to repair what was broken. The weight of 2 decades of sacrifice and separation hung between them. Patricia had given up everything, her family, her identity, her happiness, to protect her daughter from a corrupt system that had threatened to destroy them all. Her apparent abandonment had actually been the ultimate expression of a mother's love, a choice to endure years of solitude and pain to ensure her family's survival. A commotion erupted in the courtroom just as Patricia finished explaining everything to Rosie. District Attorney Lawrence Brennan burst through the chamber doors, his expensive suit disheveled and his face twisted with rage. 2 federal agents moved to intercept him, but he was faster than anyone expected. In one fluid motion, Brennan pulled a small handgun from beneath his jacket. The metallic click of the safety being released echoed through the suddenly silent room. Before anyone could react, he grabbed Patricia, pressing the barrel against her temple. 20 years of planning, he snarled, his carefully maintained public facade crumbling. 20 years of watching and waiting, and you were working against me the entire time. Rosie's heart hammered in her chest as she watched her newly found mother being held at gunpoint. Federal agents spread throughout the room, their weapons drawn, but Brennan used Patricia as a shield. "Drop your weapons," he commanded, tightening his grip on Patricia's arm, "or the honorable judge here won't live to see another case." The lead agent signaled his team to lower their weapons, though they maintained their defensive positions. Rosie's emergency response training kicked in, helping her notice details despite her fear. The slight tremor in Brennan's hand, the sweat beading on his forehead, the wild look in his eyes of a man who knew he had nothing left to lose. "You really think you can walk out of here?" Patricia's voice remained steady despite the gun pressed to her head. "The building is surrounded. Your network is exposed. It's over, Lawrence." "Shut up!" he shouted, jerking her roughly. "You don't get to talk. Not after what you've done. I trusted you. I thought I had you under control." Rosie took a careful step forward, her hands raised. "Mr. Brennan, think about what you're doing. Taking a federal judge hostage will only make things worse for you." His eyes snapped to her, recognition dawning. "You," he spat. "The nervous little witness? Another lie. You're both liars." He laughed bitterly. "Mother and daughter, working together to destroy everything I've built." "We weren't working together," Rosie said, taking another small step. "I didn't even know she was my mother until today. You're the one who forced her to abandon her family. You're the reason I grew up without a mother." Brennan's grip tightened on Patricia. "I gave her a choice. She chose to run." "I chose to protect my daughter," Patricia said firmly. "Something you wouldn't understand, Lawrence. You've never cared about anyone but yourself." The district attorney's face contorted with fury. "I built something that worked. The system was efficient. A few lives lost here and there. Acceptable casualties to keep everything running smoothly. But you couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? Acceptable casualties?" Rosie's voice rose with controlled anger. "I was an emergency dispatcher. I heard people dying because response times were delayed. Real people with families, with children. All so you could line your pockets with disaster relief funds." Brennan's eyes darted between the two women, the federal agents and the door. "Here's what's going to happen," he announced, his voice shaking slightly. "The judge and I are going to walk out of here. Anyone tries to stop us, she dies. Once I'm clear, I'll release her." "You're lying," Rosie said, her heart pounding as she watched her mother's life hanging by a thread. "You'll kill her the moment you're safe. You can't let her live, knowing what she knows." "Smart girl," Brennan sneered. "Like mother, like daughter. Now back off, all of you. We're leaving." He began moving toward the door, dragging Patricia with him. The federal agents adjusted their positions, maintaining distance but ready to act. Rosie could see her mother's eyes, calm, determined, unafraid. After 20 years of sacrifice and separation, after finally learning the truth about why her mother left, Rosie couldn't bear the thought of losing her again. "Stop," Rosie called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "You want a hostage? Take me instead." "Rosie, no." Patricia's composure cracked for the first time. Brennan paused, considering. "Why would I do that?" "Because I'm the one who gathered the evidence against you," Rosie said. "I'm the one who infiltrated your network. I'm the one who can testify to everything. Let her go. Take me." The district attorney's eyes narrowed as he calculated his options. The gun wavered slightly against Patricia's temple as sweat dripped down his face. The tension in the room was suffocating as everyone waited to see what he would do. "No deal," he finally said. "I'm taking you both. That way neither of you can testify." He gestured with the gun. "Over there, against the wall. Move slowly." Rosie complied, her mind racing as she tried to find a way out of this nightmare. She had just discovered the truth about her mother's sacrifice, had just begun to understand the depth of love that had driven Patricia to give up everything to protect her family. Now they were both at the mercy of the man who had torn their family apart 20 years ago. The federal agents maintained their positions, weapons ready, but unable to act while Brennan had hostages. Mother and daughter stood side by side, facing the corrupt district attorney who had caused them so much pain. His gun moved between them as he backed toward the door, his desperation making him more dangerous with each passing moment. Rosie's mind raced as she stood beside her mother, both of them at gunpoint. Her emergency response training had taught her to look for patterns, to notice small details that others might miss. She saw how Brennan's hand trembled slightly when he moved the gun between them, how his attention kept darting to the door. Most importantly, she noticed the water pitcher on the judge's bench just within her reach. "You won't get away with this," Rosie said, deliberately raising her voice to draw Brennan's attention. "The entire building is surrounded." "Shut up!" Brennan snapped, his gun hand jerking toward her. In that split second of distraction, Rosie grabbed the heavy glass pitcher and hurled it directly at the overhead lights. The crash was deafening as glass rained down, plunging the courtroom into partial darkness. Brennan instinctively looked up, shielding his eyes. "Federal agents, move in!" a voice commanded. Patricia took advantage of Brennan's momentary confusion, driving her elbow hard into his ribs. The gun went off, the bullet embedding itself harmlessly in the wall. Before he could recover, 3 agents tackled him to the ground. The weapon skittered across the floor as Brennan went down hard, his face pressed against the cold marble. "You're under arrest," an agent announced, snapping handcuffs onto Brennan's wrists. "Lawrence Brennan, you have the right to remain silent." More agents poured into the courtroom, securing the area and apprehending Brennan's associates who had been positioned throughout the building. The corruption network that had terrorized the city for 20 years was finally being dismantled. Rosie rushed to her mother, who was being checked for injuries by a medic. "Mom, are you okay?" Patricia's eyes filled with tears as she pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. "I'm fine. That was incredibly brave and incredibly reckless. You could have been killed." "I couldn't lose you," Rosie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Not after just finding out the truth. Not after learning why you left." Across the room, Brennan was being hauled to his feet, his expensive suit now dusty and disheveled. The mask of respectability he'd worn for so long had crumbled completely, revealing the desperate criminal beneath. "This isn't over," he snarled as agents led him toward the door. "You think you've won? I still have people. I still have influence." "No, Lawrence," Patricia said firmly, keeping one arm around Rosie. "Your network is exposed. Your associates are being arrested as we speak. The evidence Rosie gathered is irrefutable. It's finally over." The lead FBI agent approached them, nodding respectfully. "Judge Santos, Agent McCarthy, excellent work. We've already arrested 12 members of Brennan's organization, including 3 city officials and 2 police captains. The corruption network is finished." Rosie watched as Brennan was led away, the man who had forced her mother into hiding, who had stolen 20 years of their life together, finally facing justice. The weight of 2 decades of secrets and sacrifice hung heavy in the air between mother and daughter. "I don't know where we go from here," Rosie admitted softly, looking at her mother. "There's so much lost time, so many questions." Patricia squeezed her daughter's hand. "We start over. We take it one day at a time. The truth is finally out, and we have all the time in the world to rebuild what Brennan tried to destroy." Around them, federal agents continued their work, documenting evidence and securing the scene. The corruption network that had seemed untouchable just hours ago was being dismantled piece by piece. Justice had finally caught up with Lawrence Brennan, but for Rosie and Patricia, the journey of healing was just beginning. 3 months after the trial, Judge Patricia Santos sat in her chambers, carefully removing the nameplate from her desk. 20 years of service on the federal bench had earned her respect and authority, but now she was choosing something more precious: time with her daughter. Her resignation letter lay signed on the polished mahogany desk. Some of her colleagues had tried to talk her out of stepping down, arguing that she could continue serving while rebuilding her relationship with Rosie. But Patricia knew better. She had already sacrificed too many years with her daughter for the sake of duty. The door opened softly and Rosie appeared, her auburn hair catching the afternoon light. "Ready, Mom?" Patricia smiled, still marveling at how natural that word was becoming between them. "Just finishing up here?" She placed the nameplate in a cardboard box with her other personal items. 20 years of my life in one small box. "Do you regret leaving?" Rosie asked, helping her mother gather the last few items. "Not for a second," Patricia replied firmly. "I've spent enough time behind this bench. Now it's time to focus on what really matters." They carried the box together to Patricia's car, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. These past months had been filled with long conversations, shared meals, and gradual steps toward understanding. Each day brought new revelations about their lost years, new chances to heal old wounds. Later that afternoon, they drove to Oak Hill Cemetery, where Thomas McCarthy, Rosie's father, had been laid to rest 5 years earlier. The autumn wind rustled through the trees as they walked among the headstones, Rosie leading the way to a quiet corner beneath an old oak tree. Patricia's steps faltered when she saw her husband's name etched in granite. She had never been able to visit before, never had the chance to say goodbye. Rosie squeezed her mother's hand as they stood before the grave. "He never stopped loving you," Rosie said softly. "Even when he thought you'd abandoned us, he wouldn't hear anyone speak badly about you. He always said there must have been a reason." Patricia knelt beside the headstone, tears falling freely now. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, touching the cold stone. "I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell you everything. I wanted to explain why I had to leave." Her voice broke. "Brennan threatened to kill you both if I stayed. I couldn't risk losing you that way. But I lost you anyway, didn't I?" Rosie knelt beside her mother, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. The harsh judge's exterior that Patricia had worn for so long had crumbled completely, revealing the heartbroken woman beneath. "I understand now," Rosie said, her own tears falling. "Why you were so hard on me in court. Why you had to keep pushing me away. You were still trying to protect me, weren't you?" Patricia nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Every harsh word felt like a knife in my heart. But I had to maintain the deception. If Brennan had suspected who you really were, who we were to each other. "I know, Mom. I know." Rosie pulled her mother closer. "Dad would understand too. He always believed in justice, in doing what's right no matter the cost." They sat together in silence, the autumn sun warming their shoulders. Finally, Patricia spoke again, her voice stronger. "I never got to tell him how brave he was raising you alone, how proud I was of the woman you became." She touched the headstone one last time. "I promise you, Thomas, I'm not leaving again. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for lost time with our daughter." Rosie helped her mother to her feet, and they stood together, supporting each other. After 20 years of silence and sacrifice, of hidden truths and protected lies, they could finally speak freely, finally be mother and daughter without fear. Hand in hand, they walked away from the grave, leaving behind the weight of secrets and separation. The path ahead would not be easy, but they would walk it together, one step at a time, healing the wounds of the past and building a new future. United at last. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.